Hello and welcome to GuyLogicGaming. My name is Temko, and this is Dawn of War 3, set in the Warhammer 40k universe. Developed by Relic Entertainment and published by Sega, it is the third installment in the Dawn of War franchise, a RTS in the sort of classical sense with a bit of an identity crisis. Now, as an experiment for this video, I've set some timestamps down in the description below, so you can skip straight on ahead to the segment you want to hear about. What we're going to talk about primarily is the PC performance and everything related to the PC build, followed by some progression and gameplay aspects of the game that I'm not a great fan of, and then we'll dive in some multiplayer to talk about the actual gameplay, and there are some timestamps down below for you to skip to the relevant segment for you. Or just stick around for the entire video because it does provide some very relevant information. First things first is the options menu and talking about the PC build. The first thing you notice in this option menu is a distinct lack of the ability to set it to full screen or windowed mode. The game always runs in full screen windowed with no way to change that, and this is absolutely baffling. It's a PC exclusive title and it is not on the Windows Live Store, which does this sort of thing. So why doesn't it have a ability to set the full screen or windowed mode you prefer? It's really annoying. Now, the game does constrain mouse to window, which is a benefit, but still it takes a performance hit for no particular reason by not running it in exclusive full screen. I'm not a great fan of that. Furthermore, the display resolutions in the game are really weird. I have two ways of setting it to 920 by 1080, two ways to set it by 992p, and then so on. I have various different modes to set it to a specific resolution that really doesn't appear to be any different in any real way. So there is that. Other than that, the game does have most of what you'd expect in terms of a RTS visuals, with physics, AA, unit occlusion, VSync on or off, and everything related to that, as well as a brightness meter you can adjust to your benefit. Gameplay UI changes wise, the game is a little bit lacking, but again, we're comparing to StarCraft here, which is always a bit of an unfair advantage for StarCraft, because that is the holy grail of RTS in the current day and time. Talking about unit decorations, you can add specific decorations and other stuff like that. Sticky selection, mouse wheel zoom, whether or not you want that, silhouettes, and so on. So just customize a little bit of your preference. I have disabled some things, enabled some things. Right side control, for example, for elite units, you can move that left or right. I've left on the left side, so there is some customization here, but most of the customization you'd expect in terms of the actual gameplay aspect of the game is fairly limited. Lastly, we come to the audio segment, which has sound, cinematic subtitles, and in-game subtitles. Sound quality is a nice addition here, being high or low, and it has tooltips for most of these things, which is fairly good in and of itself. The fact that there are some lacking options overall is not the greatest. And you have the full suite of audio options. So you might be wondering, what am I missing here? What did I skip? Well, it's called rebindable keys, and that is not okay. I do not understand why games don't include rebindable keys in any game, but especially in RTS titles. It just baffles the mind. An RTS designed around optimizing your APM to your preferred player benefit. If you want to use a mouse with multiple buttons, you should be able to use that. If you want to use an additional gamepad or something like that, you should be able to do that. And if you want to customize the actual interactive buttons away from whatever they have set them to, because you have a preferred gameplay style or there's a more optimal gameplay style based on your build, your gameplay focus, or even your race, to progress and more optimize your gameplay, for an RTS that is immensely important, and they offer nothing of the sort, which is just plain annoying. So overall, the PC build runs okay. Performance-wise, it's not fantastic. There are some issues here and there in regards to saving settings and not being saved. There's a hotfix on the way for that. And there's some other stuff here, like the chat being in a weird location when you're playing the game, auto-defaulting to all chat instead of team chat, and some other really weird choices developers have made that sort of baffle me compared to other titles, but that's when you get into the sort of identity crisis of the title. And that's why some people are calling it a MOBA, and it's not. It's definitely an RTS. It's not a great RTS, but it's an RTS. But why people are calling it a MOBA really comes down to two things. It's the map design and the gameplay mode for the multiplayer maps, as well as the progression system in the game. So what am I talking about here? Progression-wise, the game has elites, and these elites are specific units that have a high power output. They can kill multitudes of enemies and multitudes of grunts in the game, and they're named units that have their own levels and their own special abilities that they can use during gameplay. And you're looking at the Orc elite now, and out of the three races, the Space Marines, the Eldar, and the Orcs, I've unlocked a bunch of these elites. And you unlock them by using skulls, and you get skulls by either playing the campaign and unlocking various objectives, or by playing the multiplayer and getting a few skulls here and there. Now, you're gonna have to play the campaign for a particular number of reasons, and again, not a fan of this, because you need to get lots of skulls, and the only way to get skulls initially very fast is the campaign, where you level up immensely fast and get your heroes and elites up to the level where you are objectively equal to your opponent in multiplayer. If you don't do that, you don't get the elites you need, you don't get these extra focuses you can get for the various traits and doctrines you have. You're gonna end up with a build that is inferior, statistically inferior to your opponent, and end up being on the back foot for the entire game. You could probably win if you're good enough, but that is not okay for an RTS game, so I'm not a fan of that. The worst thing here is, it's not that you have no leveled elites in multiplayer, or all doctrines are unlocked by default in the multiplayer, or something similar like that. No, you have to unlock the doctrines and the elites one by one, and if your opponent has unlocked them and you haven't, still can't use them. On top of that, the various elites are usable by up-leveling them, and if you level up an elite, you can unlock new abilities, and each time you level them up, you get a specific extra stuff. So you get skull sometimes you get commando camo paint, so you can use different color scheme on him. At other times, you get a extra ability for him, and you can equip that ability, and so on and so forth. And based on these abilities, your elites are going to improve in power and be more useful during gameplay. The very fact of the matter is that these elites are necessary to win the game. You cannot win without using an extensive amount of elites at any given time. And generally speaking, I'm not the greatest fan of this in the best of times. Hero units in general are not a great thing I enjoy. But when a game is designed well around hero units, that they are a cost-benefit analysis, you can summon a hero unit or a high-end experimental unit or something like that, and then you have offset that based on the whole army you have, then there is a balanced sequence. But in this case here of Dawn of War 3, there is no balanced sequence. The units are free. Once summoned with the elite points you generate during a match, you can re-summon them if they die after a short cooldown, which basically means that you have a free unit that does not cost upkeep, that does not cost anything to summon really, just has a delay until you can summon it in the match, and you have a massively powerful unit on the field that can kill dozens of enemy units at any given time. On top of that, you can summon them basically anywhere efficient on the map. Any map control point you have, near any building you control. It baffles the mind that this is a balanced variant, and it's not balanced. Elites are extremely powerful, and having control over elites during the game is the reason to win. Any other unit is basically a delayed tactic or a father versus father fight, so you can get your elites in there and do as much damage as possible. It's not great. The doctrines, on the other hand, do provide a nice level of customization, where your army doctrines can provide things like extra shielding when you have a aspect that goes broken. Maybe if you want to use your boys, if you're an orc, they get extra speed if you have this doctrine. You have structural doctrines that creates, for example, a barrier on the war towers while they're channeling the ability. And as you go forward, you unlock these doctrines and you can equip them during combat based on the sort of structural build and structural gameplay style you want to go for. And that is a pretty cool thing. The idea here is that the game wants you to coordinate with your teammates in a multiplayer match and then figure out a best tactic. Maybe one player goes for an early game build, goes for a push build, gives the other two players that play more of a late game style more time to customize their build or get to the late game stages. Or maybe you want to coordinate a hyper rush game with all three of you, and you set your doctrines to benefit each other for that fight. And this is obviously very clearly what the developers were thinking, because the game is very, very, very focused on the multiplayer aspects of the title. Not so much the multiplayer 1v1 mode. The multiplayer 2v2 and 3v3 modes are especially where the game was built around. And you can see that in every nuance of the game. Defaulting on group chats, defaulting on all chats, defaulting on selection windows about a minute before a game starts, so you can switch around your various loadouts for your heroes or elites as well as doctrines. Now, the game isn't all bad, but the customization here in the Warhammer 40k universe also isn't fantastic. While you have some options to change the paint schemes for your various units, it doesn't really matter, because even when you customize the colors for the various units, you still can't give them any specific equipment or anything unique of that sort. It's still just a color paint job, regardless of what unit you look at. So it's very, very much limited and subpar. Short of trying something very specific, very limited control over what you can do and can do. So, not the greatest fan of the 40k implementation here, because outside of color schemes, there really isn't a lot of customization for you to use anything with that. This also brings me down to the final point I'd like to make before we dive into gameplay. While you are playing the Warhammer 40k universe, it doesn't feel like a Warhammer 40k title. While the elites and all the named characters are excellent, none of the grunts, none of the cannon fodder you play with really feels that great. If you're playing with Space Marines, they are the weakest of weak units in the game, barely able to sustain a fight with some of the boys in their club matches, mallets, whatever they want to call them. And that's because of a gameplay balance choice. But outside of trying to figure out things how they should work, maybe an elite squad of 3 Marines versus an elite squad of 20,000 boys would be a good balance match visually and viscerally for the player. The game really doesn't do anything of the sort, and it just feels like the Space Marines are inadequately underpowered versus a overpowered set of, grunty little Gretchen boys trying to fight their shit out. It's not exactly what I would call great. Now, the races are very diverse in gameplay as well as the way you play them, and I do enjoy that. So what we're going to do is we're going to dive into a multiplayer match and talk about the gameplay balance and the gameplay modes that are available. So multiplayer exists out of 2 variants. There is the custom online or custom solo mode if you want to play versus an AI. You can also load a skirmish if you've previously saved one, which is pretty straightforward. You can do a quick match against opponents, also pretty straightforward. But the thing is, there is a very big thing in relation to what is going on with the multiplayer, and that is the map availability. When you look at the maps, there is a grand total of 3 1v1 maps available, 2 2v2 maps available, and 3 3v3 maps available. And that is just not okay. In a multiplayer game, only having 7-8 maps available is not okay. There really isn't that much variety, neither in gameplay tactics, in map composition, and there is no difference in gameplay modes. The only mode available in the game is a kill the core mode, and this is where most of the confusion comes from when people start comparing it to a MOBA. I'll get into that in a second. So let's go ahead and dive into a solo match against the AI, and I'll talk about the issues with the multiplayer maps, the multiplayer balance, as well as the overall RTS issues with the game. So as we load into a single player versus the AI, where the orcs, the AI is a Space Marine on normal mode, I want to talk about 2 things primarily. One is the lack of maps and game modes, and the other is the way the game mode and the gameplay sort of rolls out as an RTS. Now, the game mode is that you kill a shield generator first, then you kill a defensive structure second, and then you kill the core structure of a base third. Now, obviously, this is very reminiscent of MOBA games where you kill a tower first, then an inhibitor second, and then a core or source structure third. And this is pretty much a direct copy of that same idea. And in general, that's not a bad idea. It's a very staged gameplay mode where you have to push in and force yourself to the shield, then a tower, then a core, and your opponent has time to counterattack or even provide a defensive buff to themselves, sort of regroup while you're trying to do that. The problem here is that this is the only game mode available. There is no traditional RTS style game mode where you have to kill your opponent, or they have to bow out, or you have to annihilate, or anything like that. There is this mode and this mode alone. And this mode provides 2 major issues with, outside of the map design, the gameplay in general. If you're playing 1v1, once you start to lose, you are going to lose. Once you lose your main shield or your main tower, you will not recover from that. At that point, your opponent will have control over most of the map, and getting back from that point, even if the game has pretty decent comeback potential, is nigh on impossible. So the game really offers one tactic and one tactic alone. It's a very heavy early game aggression, then a very defensive mid game, followed by a very heavy late game. So you have a very early mid game where you send units all over the map to capture these control points and build towers on them, because your opponent's units will not have time to kill them before you can respond with your units. And you start a sort of tug of war with you slowly reinforcing all your points. Whether you're the Eldar or the Space Marines or the Orcs, it doesn't really matter which race you are. Following that, you go ahead and sort of start upgrading, start building out, start collecting your army together, especially starting to gather the elite points you need to summon your elite units. Once you're done that, you sort of gather everything in a big blob of doom and smash it against your opponent. In general, if you've done the first stage correctly, you will have either just over 2/3 of the map in terms of resource points. If you haven't and your opponent has 2/3, at that point you might as well just bow out and lose. But there's a problem with bowing out of the title. Unlike other RTS games with progression, and there are a few, bowing out of this game does not help you in any way. What it really does is you just sort of lose every progression. When you lose the game by dying, you at least get experience for your elites, you get some extra bonus points here and there, you may get some skulls to unlock new doctrines, new units. If you bow out by pressing the quit button or surrender button, you get nothing. Absolutely nothing, which is just a bad idea in general, which means players are rewarded for staying in the game until the very last moment instead of accepting their defeat and going on to the next game or the next match. Not a fan of this design choice. Secondly, if you both control about half the map, it becomes a very bland stalemate because neither player wants to attack. This poses a second problem. Attacking in this game is very disadvantageous to you unless you have the clear upper hand, because building units takes a very long time and resource generation is exceedingly slow. You have to slowly build up your army over the course of a match. In this about 20-minute match here, I will have built up just about half the maximum sized army, and that is generally okay. I'm not opposed to a slow start or a slow low count map generation. What I am opposed to is the idea that attacking is so disadvantageous because your opponent will have defensive structures, may have some shielded units here and there, which is another problem with the game I have. I'll get to that in a second, that you might lose 1, 2 or 3 units more than he does, and you will not be able to recover from this simply due to the fact that, well, while your opponent may have lost 1 unit or 2 units, you will have lost double that, and generating those units based on the lost resources in an equally divided map means you will lose down the late game. There's going to be no recovery from this, provided you're both about equal in skill. Now, as I said, the cover system is another issue I have with the game. Defensively and offensively, the cover system does not provide any benefit. From a defensive side, the cover system works by having these very specific locations on the map where your units can stand in, wait for a couple of seconds until it activates, and then they provide a general shield bonus. Now, only other melee units can enter the structure while combat. Ranged units don't even enter the structure, they just start firing it from outside. Your units, while in the structure, can fire outside, obviously if they're ranged, but half the time they don't even notice the fact that they're in a shield generator and just end up going outside and get killed. So you end up having to micromanage every single unit all the time just to make sure they don't kill themselves by stepping outside of the micromanageable structures you have in terms of shielding, in terms of resource points, in terms of defensive structures. It is an absolute clusterfuck. Might as well not have included that system at all in the game for all the benefit it does either side. Not a fan. Speaking about defensive structures, the RTS base building aspect of this game is also woefully underdeveloped in my opinion. There's, for the orcs, a grand total of 6 buildings, and one of which is a defensive structure on top of your resource point. The fact that you only have 5 buildings where everything gets generated from is not cool, and there's also no way for orcs to sort of expand beyond what they're doing, whereas the Eldar have a gate where you can teleport units to and move units back and forth between various structures, so there is a benefit to them having structures further up the field and having structures in exposed locations. The only structure your orcs are going to build further exposed from the main core base is going to be the Warp Towers, and even then, you're probably only going to have 2 or maximum of 3 Warp Towers if you're very, very aggressive outside of safety confines of your shielded tower. Which means that this game is all about turtle and slow expansion over any aggressive gameplay style or exposed advancing gameplay style with multiple bases. It really restricts the gameplay options you have available. And the other races are no different. While the races in general are very unique from one another, the actual gameplay between the races is nearly identical in terms of tactics and what you try to achieve. It's not that the Space Marines have a more aggressive style because they have abilities that can jump and they don't have a necessity to, like the orcs, upgrade based on towers, and they're not dependent on shields like the Eldar. It's all true, but in terms of the way they go over the map, in terms that you have progression between mid to late game, it's all identical. You always have to slowly build up that army, slowly get that giant wrecking ball going, and then you move forward. The third problem here is the elites. A single elite can probably take out up to 5 groups of enemies at any given time without any need or intervention from any other of your units. Which means that once you have 3 elites on the field, and if the game goes on long enough, you will have 3 elites on the field regardless of how expensive they are, you will have a fight of about 30, maybe 40 different grunt units. 3 of these extremely cheap, if not free, because all they take is a delay on the resource, elite units, and there's no reason for you to ever bother doing anything else. At a certain point, all you're going to be doing is sending in your elites, fighting his elites, and sort of trying to maneuver your units away from his elite units because there's no benefit to attacking them with your normal units. It really restricts the amount of tactics you can use, and it really restricts the responsiveness of what you can do. If an enemy has an elite attacking you, you have to respond with an elite. Your regular units are just not going to cut it. And if they are going to cut it, you are so far ahead of your opponent that you can throw away 5 to 10 different groups of units to on an elite, you would have won the game anyway at that point, so it doesn't really matter. That doesn't mean that they're not cool mechanics. I especially like the way this progression goes in terms of the way orcs upgrade their units using scrap. Obviously very cool. I also like the way Space Marines go forward based on the way they upgrade their units using the upgrade system. I like the way the Eldar are really shield dependent, so using the shields of an Eldar and you regenerate your shields by putting them near a warp gate, so you have to strategically position your warp gates and your way gates everywhere. I do like this quite a bit. Especially on the Eldar side, it's really rewarding to strategically plan out locations for fights because you can pull back to a way gate and get benefits to your units that are fighting. Excellent overall. Now the third point I want to come to is not so much a negative as a design choice, and this is either going to be something you like or don't like. For me personally, somebody that really enjoys games like Supreme Commander and Total Annihilation, I don't like this thing. Why not? Well, I am not a great fan of excessive micromanagement. I feel StarCraft finds a little bit on the too excessive micro thing compared to other games, but this game does it even more so. Nearly every unit has 1 or 2 unique abilities. These don't auto-trigger ever, you have to manually trigger all of them. On top of that, your elites may have 3 or 4 abilities at any given time, with no indication of how to trigger. There's no hotkeys for most of these triggers on the fly, so you have to select a specific unit and then cycle through every unique unit. There's also no way to say tap and get all the boys to trigger their rage ability. There's also no way to go ahead and say I want this elite to fire this ability based on prioritization in the queue. None of that is available. It also doesn't cycle through various units in any logical sense, it just goes through all the units available. Isn't great. Now you can use control groups to mitigate a little bit of this, but you end up having 30 units in 6 different control groups trying to sort of mitigate this problem, and I'm not a fan at all. Moving on, the game tries to sort of give the player the advantage in terms of the ability to harass. The idea, obviously, the developers had is that you go out and you harass one another, take a resource point, move to a different direction, maybe kill a group here, kill a group there. If you're fighting the orcs, you try to take out the warp towers and the scrap they've been accumulating for upgrades, and so on. But the reality is, as I said earlier, is that none of that happens because any show of force where you lose more units than you get means you lose at the end game because units are so slow and expensive to build. Lastly, there is no real upgrade system in place in terms of tier progression. While there are tiered progressions, by the 5-minute mark you will have tier 3 units available to you. You will probably not have the resources to build a large amount of them, but unlike other games where tier progression really forces you to expand buildings in your base and choose different directions for your progression, a good example here would be StarCraft again, where you have to build specific buildings to get to carriers. Or if you want to build a battleship, you're going to have to build several different buildings and maybe even research different types of technology to do that, and your opponent can scout that, see what's going on, and respond to that based on a different variety of tactics. Because there's only 5 buildings in the game, because all the progression in this game boils down to do I have all the buildings and can I build all the units, they're all tied into those specific things. The upgrade system also for units is very simplified. There's one building that deals with all the upgrades, and while there's 3 tiers of upgrade, they're all pretty bland, saying one is damage, one is health for your infantry, one is damage, one is health for your mechanized units, and then there's 2 or 3 race specific upgrades such as the charge for banshees on the Eldar side and an ability for orcs for the boys to have sort of cumulative shielding for each other. Very underwhelming overall. So it really feels like the developers are focused on the multiplayer side of things for multiplayer gameplay, so 2v2 and 3v3. And while I can understand a desire to focus more on the group fights, that is also why the game has so few buildings and so few resource points on any given time on the map. When you're playing 2v2 or 3v3, you end up with having 50 units on the map, and because you only like 5 or 10 of them are yours, it's much easier to control the various independent units. And because you have to communicate with your allies and enemies, you sort of figure out what's going on. At that point, it becomes logical that you only have so many resource points on the map, only have so many buildings you can build in a game, because the map is only so big and there's only so much space for different structures, and because all the various unique units, every player is going to feel like they're really contributing to a fight, even if they're only contributing with their elites and a couple of extra grunts. No one player is going to have the biggest, massivest army, and the other players are going to sort of AFK, sit back and relax. But when you're talking about 1v1, when you're talking about competitive gameplay, it falls fully flat on its face in a very bland, stylized, every match is identical type of game. The amount of tactics that are available is limited, The amount of responses to each tactic is also extremely stilted and limited, and the amount of units available, while interesting units overall and while interesting in terms of their abilities and mechanics, is again very stilted and limited both in technical progression and unit composition, because at the end of the day you will be wielding most of the units most of the time. You're not going to focus on air or ground or mechanized or infantry. You're going to be building everything. Not a bad idea, but it's also not exactly unique, that it provides interesting gameplay based on every game. So that brings me to the final point I'd like to make, is the fact that as an RTS, this game has a bit of an identity crisis. It tries to be streamlined, more like a MOBA is, in terms of what you're doing, more specific hero combinations, more specific powerful combinations where you feel like you're doing something amazing, smashing massive armies with a single unit. That immense feeling of satisfaction that you have from playing a hero in a MOBA game, while trying to stay an RTS, while trying to remain a very solid core game with army compositions and different unit types and varieties. And it sort of fails at either at that point, because it still has the complexity of micromanagement, it still has the complexity of APM style gameplay, it still has the necessity of expansion and resource accumulation, but it then also has all the added complexity of controlling heroes specifically and controlling them individually, and having the effects of very strong single units that sort of dominate the battlefield regardless of what is going on. Not a great fan. The note here to take away from Dawn of War 3's gameplay is that while an interesting idea, the execution is flawed in so many places that it results in a unfun and not fair gameplay for anyone involved. What do I mean by that? Twofold. As I said earlier, heroes level up, these elites level up, you can buy them and then you have them available, another player might not, and there is no ranked system of any kind that you match to equal opponents. Second, army doctrines are so very important, they provide so many tangible bonuses and you have to unlock each and every one of them manually during gameplay. Lastly, you don't know what your opponent's doing, so you might have a sort of build loss by decision because your opponent may have a very specific build that counters your specific build. Again, none of the options allow you to counteract that during gameplay because they're preset. You're basically counterpicked at that point. And you can't counterpick your opponent because this is a blind sort of pick. In a multiplayer 2v2 or 3v3 match, you and your allies can sort of coordinate a little bit on that regard, but again, your opponents could do the same and you end up with the same situation because you can't really see what the other is doing until you load in. Unit management is subpar. Unit micromanagement, while excessive in need, is also subpar in control. Unit complexity and build complexity is also subpar, while the unit variety is okay. It seems like the game has taken every good bit of every MOBA and not implemented it, and then taken every bad bit of every RTS and implemented it. It's not great. I'm not having fun with multiplayer because either I crush my opponent or he crushes me, or it's a 20-minute stalemate of neither of us doing anything. I'm not having fun with a single player because of the voice acting being abysmal, the campaign having no clear focus of any kind. I've noticed, you're playing 3 races individually at the same time and switching between the races during the campaign. And while there is a story, quote unquote, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And because of the way the gameplay is structured, you're mostly playing around with a few sets of units and not really paying attention to much of anything else, sort of trying to complete the missions. And the missions are padded and excessively lengthy without providing a reason to be so. The only reason you might take 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes for a campaign mission is because of the resource accumulation being so slow. You might only have 1 or 2 resource points in a mission and then have to kill 50 enemy bases during that mission. You're gonna have a lot of time needed to get the necessary units to destroy all these various bases that obviously do not have the same constraints you do. It's not exactly great. So in conclusion, Dawn of War 3 performs okay, but is lacking some serious technical competence in terms of its PC build, and as it's a PC exclusive only build, in multiplayer it has a distinct lack of maps and game modes. It also has a distinct lack of variety in terms of tactical gameplay, while it does have a nice variety in unit complexity and unit composition. It also has a very distinct lack of focus for the 1v1 variant of the game, as well as a very distinct lack of capabilities for that. While it does try to focus on the 2v2 and 3v3 variant, it also sort of misses the mark there by not including things like in-game voice over IP, only chat modes that then default to the old chat where your opponents can also see it. It tries to straddle the middle road between a MOBA and an RTS, with the MOBA simplicity and uniqueness of being a unique hero that can crush an army, with the RTS's more mundane, you have an army, use it wisely and counteract your opponent, and sort of misses the mark on either side. Lastly, while I can't really comment on the various implementations of the 40k story and the 40k world, I can comment that certain characters just don't feel that strong. As I said earlier, Space Marines feel sort of weak, and the lack of customization you have for your army, sort of changing a few colors, really is not that great. You can't put different bolters on your Space Marines, you can't give your orcs different outfits, you can't get a different type of mech build, and while you could have it in red, yellow, purple, short pants, pink, you can't really do anything other than that. And while some of the heroes have different skins, again, fairly limited. So overall, Dawn of War 3 is a miss in many situations and does not provide the fun and enjoyment for an RTS that Dawn of War 1 and 2 did, nor does it provide the story-heavy Warhammer 40k gameplay that many people were hoping it would. As it stands, I currently see no reason to recommend Dawn of War 3, especially not at a full retail price. You may want to pick it up if you're a Warhammer fan down the line on a sale, but otherwise, I'd sort of skip this one and replay Dawn of War 2. So thank you for watching. If you liked this video, press that like button. If you didn't like this video, there's a dislike button for exactly that purpose. And leave a comment. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like. We want to hear back from all of you. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, just press that subscribe button down below. We will deliver. And until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here, GuyLogicGaming.